Well, we turn now to the indictment of former President Donald Trump. We also want to touch on something that is called the Classified Information Procedures Act issue, which was written about but not really discussed in any way by other news outlets. That tends to happen. However, it could potentially help the former president with his case. Our next guests have both done cases with classified information involving the Classified Information Procedures Act.
Joining us now, Joe diGenova, Victoria Toensing. So what should we know about this act?
Well, I'm going to jump in there because I've worked with it a lot. It's actually called the gray mail law because it doesn't allow defendants to blackmail the government. Many defendants say, listen, if I only had this secret document, I could just prove my innocence. And so the Congress worked out a way that the person could have their cake and eat it too by getting classified information. But here's how it works. The court decides what's going to be redacted or summarized. But here, when the jurors have to look at these 31 classified documents to decide whether they fit the words of the statute regarding national defense or helping another country or hurting the United States, how can they do that with having information redacted or summarized? They have to see the whole document. The jurors do not have any security clearances. How does that work?
Joe, how do you see this unfolding? Of course, you know, there's new information coming out every day. We've heard that there could potentially be additional charges coming for the former president. As the FBI says, there are ongoing investigations. What is your assessment of where we are now and where things are going for the former president with this case?
Well, when the FBI says there are ongoing investigations, it's very important to remember that they're not talking about the Bidens. They're talking about the Donald Trump. This case is going to be one on motions and on arguments to the jury. Donald Trump will file motions to dismiss based on selective prosecution. He's going to file motions to suppress the evidence because of statements taken from his lawyers in violation of the attorney-client privilege. Even though a judge in Washington ruled that those statements could be presented to the grand jury, that issue is now brand new in front of the trial court, and she could reverse all of those rulings on the attorney-client privilege and exclude all of the testimony of his former lawyers. In addition, he's going to move to suppress all the documents that were seized at Mar-a-Lago because of an overly broad, what's called a general warrant without specificity, and because of government misconduct. You'll remember when those documents were seized, the FBI went in and they seized documents that were in boxes. But lo and behold, that night on national television, you saw a photograph of documents spread out on the floor with classified labels on the markings. Now, that wasn't the way the FBI found those documents. They put them on the floor like that to embarrass the President of the United States. This is all part of a pattern of being selectively prosecuting the president, being abusive in prosecution tactics, like the raid on Mar-a-Lago, and like laying out the documents on the floor, photographing them, and then putting that out. That is, by the way, that is a leak of information in an investigation, and that is a crime. So I think what's going to happen is the president's lawyers are going to argue all of those motions before trial, and then during trial, they're going to argue that he was selectively prosecuted, and they're going to mention Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, and James Comey. The judge has the right to allow that, and in this case, she very well may allow them to make that argument.
I assume they will make hang on a second. I wanted to ask you about the timing of all this, because those appeals made by the Trump team will come during the case, as the case is proceeding. And then the other side, I assume, is going to appeal whatever the decision is they feel is against them. So does this come down to the 11th Circuit to make these decisions ultimately? Or is it even beyond that, Supreme Court?
It could be. It depends on what the issue is, because there's another important issue, and that is why was the Espionage Act used when it shouldn't have been? The Presidential Records Act was passed much later, 50 years later, than the Espionage Act, and it was specifically meant for working out what documents the president keeps and what documents he or she doesn't. And Congress is presumed to know, well, there's an Espionage Act, and they didn't say except for classified information. So it's a very important legal issue. It's not a jury issue, it's a legal issue, and that could go to the Supreme Court before this case ever goes to trial. Does the Presidential Record Act preempt the Espionage Act, which is 50 years older?
And remember, the reason for that is very simple. The defendant in this case is the former president of the United States. In all other cases involving these records, none of the people was the president of the United States and had the right to make choices about the act and do things under the act.
Can I assume that? Can I assume the Department of Justice is going to say that's why they didn't charge him on the Presidential Records Act?
They
went with the Espionage Act, and the Espionage Act was actually written before the classified section system was implemented. Their argument would be, this is just an example. We don't care whether it's classified, but it is information we don't want out there.
No, but statutory interpretation is if an act is passed after another one, the later act, the latter act is the one that it assumes that they should know that there's an Espionage Act.
Okay.
And it's also a more specific act, and the Espionage Act is very general. In fact, as Alan Dershowitz and all of us say, it's probably unconstitutional for being vague.
Joe diGenova and Victoria Toensing, thank you so much for joining us and explaining all this. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
You bet.